The Manitowish Waters Historical Society is pleased to present Cathy Steffens and her presentation on Joe Seraphin, From Outlaw to Family Man. Follow Cathy's story of her family and her father, Joe Seraphin, who was a noted outlaw, gambler, prostitution leader, and moonshiner who ultimately became a family man running several legitimate businesses.
Hi, my name is Cathy Steffens, and the title of this video is Hops and History. That name was taken from a program put on by Jim Bokern from the Manitowish Historical Society. I heard that he had done the program and mentioned the name Joe Seraphin. And that was very interesting to me because that's my maiden name. In any event, I contacted Jim, and the rest is history. We put together a presentation about my father, who was part of this whole Moonshine in the North Woods movement. In 1895, the magazine Field and Stream printed the first article about moonshine that had appeared in a document. In 1936, the number of those documents dwindled to almost nothing. My father was born in 1894, and he was out of prison from Leavenworth, Kansas in 1936. So he lived in the main part of this era of Prohibition. Prohibition was over in 1919, or began in 1919, and was over in 1933. This is my grandfather, John Baptiste Seraphin. He is in front of the City Hall in Rhinelander. Actually, the front was the back. That building has just been turned around. So he's across the street from the Catholic school and the corner of this building. Over on the side to the far right, that building would be the that was the United States Post Office, excuse me, that white building that's Arts today. In 1900, there was a census where the Seraphin family was in that census. My grandfather was born in 1857, and he lived till 1918. He came from Canada through Chippewa Falls, then Boyd, and then Rhinelander. He was married in 1872 to Mary Talbot, and from Chippewa Falls. And if you take a look at the ages there, he would have been 15 and she was 12. In 1900, when the census was taken, there were 3 living children, although there had been 13 births. There was Clara and Charles, and then Joseph, who was my father. The Seraphin family lived in basically what was known as the Hollow. The yellow area that is up there is where their home was located. My grandfather had a dray line, and he hauled heavy goods in his dray line. The hollow itself is the yellow blocks that are in the center there, and the blue line, which doesn't show up very well, is Thayer Street. The red line is the railroad. My father's picture here was taken in 1898 when he was about 4 years old. Here's a picture of him with his niece, Verna Powers. My Aunt Clara lived at the top of the hill from where we lived, and they weren't very far away. You can see the fancy clothes that they had on for the picture. This is my father in 4th grade. He had developed a relationship with Gene Shepherd, who was the founding father of the Rhinelander and the Hodag myth. My father was in 4th grade, and they spoke French at home. So when he spoke English at school, he ended up getting his pants pulled down and getting a spanking. That's the last day my father ever went to school. It's also the last day that I'm aware of that he ever went to church. My father here is shown with his father. Grandpa John said no one with half a brain should ever work to make a profit for somebody else. So my father started his first business around age 18. When he left school from the 4th grade, he ended up driving the dray wagon for Grandpa. He went out to a lumber camp on Highway 17 South, about 10 miles south of town. He ended up driving almost all day, and when he stopped to try to eat his lunch, his sandwich was frequently frozen. One day he went to the hot pond behind the paper mill, threw his lunch in there, decided that he was not doing this anymore. He went down to the hollow, rented 2 barrels and a plank, got a gallon of whiskey and some glasses or cups or whatever he used, and started his first tavern. So that was when he was about 18 years old. We see where the first tavern would have been, down where that blob of yellow is. There were a lot of taverns there, probably as many as 30 of them, all crowded together in those buildings. Life in 1913, before World War I, was way different than it is today. Life expectancy for men was about 47 years old. You can see some of the other figures that are on the chart here. The average wage was 22 cents an hour, and the average worker made about $300 to $400 per year. There was no real college education for people who were doctors. They just came and treated people. And my father got married in 1915. He was 21 years old, and he married Olive Tillman. Olive Tillman was a daughter of a lady by the name of Grandma Tuttle. Grandma Tuttle lived on the corner of Eagle Street and what would be the cutoff that goes to the Quick Trip today. She was a moonshiner. Her family were moonshiners, and they used that property for making their moonshine. If we take a look at World War I and farm prices peaked during the war, but after the war, a recession followed. Prices just dropped. People were losing farms, banks were going broke, there was unemployment, there was economic stress throughout the area. Some of the reasons for the recession were the 15% unemployment. The production was down by 33%. The Dow Jones averaged by 45%. Federal spending went from $18.5 billion to $6.5 just in a year. So farmers had no market for their crops, and bootlegging provided them a market. My father liked the nightlife pretty well. This picture was taken around 1918 when he was about 24 years old. You can see that he loved to play cards. He was a gambler all the way. During Prohibition, there were a lot of people who were in favor of it, but there were a lot of people who were against it too. People understood that the economy was really being affected, and Prohibition was making the problem even worse. during Prohibition, there were 3 or more entities that tried to enforce the law. You had local law officials. There you had the county sheriff. You had the local police. You had the state. You had the federal government, all trying to influence law enforcement. However, they were all working independently. They didn't share a budget. They didn't share personnel. They didn't share information, each trying to do their own thing, with people who were glory hogs in each group, just trying to get a name for themselves. Here we see a picture of the new sheriff in Rhinelander. He said he was going to crack down on moonshine being served. And my father's tavern was in Rhinelander, so that made it necessary for him to come up with a solution if he didn't want the mayor on his case. My father was known as an entrepreneur, or maybe some people called him Little Caesar or Dapper Joe. You can see the way he dressed. He frequently wore a pocket watch. He had diamond rings, studs in his collars, the latest of fashions. He was very proud of the fact that he owned the first car in Rhinelander. The story is that first time he drove it, he didn't quite know how to stop it, so he got it going as slow as he could and just ran it into the side of his barn. Where he moved was about a mile out of town, so that the sheriff couldn't have access to him. If you take a look at the colors that are on the map, he bought a tavern where that red one is. That was called the Riverside Nightclub. Where the blue one is, that was called the Pine Lake Inn. You notice there's a large area between the two yard. It's actually was my playground when I was a child. The green is a house that Dad built between the two, and you can see that a private driveway leads from the riverside to the Pine Lake Inn. This is on Highway W. Here is the Riverside Nightclub as it looked back in that time. Carmi Durrani was a friend of the family. He had gone to war and come back and ran the Riverside Nightclub for quite a while. What I wanted you to see in the photo is that if you go down the hill to the left-hand side of the building, you go down into a yard that's quite a bit lower, and you can see water in the background. So the lake is back there in the background. Here's the backside of the riverside, and Dad had mules and horses that he kept back there, so that you can see, if you look at the building, it looks like a ramp going up. Those are stairways coming down, and there's a door under there to go into the basement of the riverside. The riverside did not have very tall ceilings, and that basement ceiling was probably 6 feet or less. I don't know. I was a little girl. It seemed a whole lot bigger then. But anyway, that's the back entrance, or the back side. This is the riverside today. The riverside is now called the jailhouse, good for its pizzas. Notice some features on the outside here. On that third story up there were 2 bedrooms. They had ladies of the evening there. That tall chimney was excellent for barbecuing. Dad had the first barbecue in Rhinelander. They served ribs. This is the house that was built between the 2 taverns. At one time, there was gambling up on the 2nd floor. We lived on the 1st floor. If you drive on this private driveway past the front of the house, the garage is the last window there, and you would drive into the garage from that end. Here's a lake view of that same house. Now, some interesting things about the house is this is the place where Lake Creek and Thunder Lake join, and the current there is very swift and it's very deep. When you get over by the riverside and you get real close to the riverside, it's much more shallow, but you can see the retaining wall that was built between the two places. The upside of the retaining wall, which was holding a lot of the yard, was probably about 2 or 3 feet high, but the downside was about 10 feet high. So we used to run on the top of the wall. It was a nice little game, and Dad was afraid we were going to fall off on the deep side. So he planted grapevines there so that we couldn't get up to the top of the retaining wall. This is the Pine Lake Inn back in the day. My dad remodeled this in 1939, but this was a picture from the 1920s. You can see the way that the entrance to the bar is on the right, and then it goes in from the side. And the entrance to the living quarters is the door on the left with the stone porch. These are some of the girls that worked for my father. I'm not quite sure where they lived. I imagine they lived in both the Riverside and the Pine Lake Inn. This is an article or information taken from an article written by Chris Gilbertson, who was a reporter for the Daily News in the 1950s. He researched and came up with some of this information that we see here. The operations were reportedly owned by Al Capone, and John Beulah was his brewmaster. I forgot to mention that this is about a raid that took place in Harrison Hills, which is south of Rhinelander. The prices that you see on the top line there show you the comparative values of today's money and that money. John Beulah, who reportedly worked for Al Capone, was the master brewer. He was known to be able to brew moonshine with more than 99% purity. He had 2 people working for him, Elitra and Abe Cherney. Anyway, the stills capacity was quite large. They could produce 250 gallons a day. What they had was they rented a farm, and they had the distillery in the barn. But under the tanks, they had hiding places for the workers. And so they were told that if the feds came, they were to get into those places and stay there until they were told to come out, that it was safe. Well, one morning they had a raid. It was about 7 o'clock in the morning. They hid in their places, but some of them got real tired of being down there by about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So one guy got out of his hiding place and started to make a run for it, was shot in the leg. He refused to see a doctor because he knew that he would be caught. He ended up getting gangrene in that leg, and they cut that leg off. So at the riverside, they had some of the booze that came from that place. In 1929, My father and a business partner of his by the name of Hugh Smith were in the town of Pine Lake, and they were arrested for bootlegging. The fine that the bail that they had to post was equal to $34,000, although it wasn't not that much, but it was a huge drain on them. It took a year or two for this to go through, but they were finally sentenced. They were found guilty, and here we see more information about that same case. I believe the fine was $50 and some short time in jail. There were, in 1932, 3 years later, there were taverns on Main Street in Rhinelander who were serving moonshine. Sam Kearney ran a place called Al's Place. Sam was a relative of two of the people who were arrested out in Harrison Hills. So there were families of people who were into moonshine. Someone else who was running a tavern was Ray Powers Jr. Ray Powers Jr. was my dad's nephew, but they were very close in age and in looks. They would imitate one another. People who didn't know them wouldn't know they weren't twins, and so they could dress alike and go out and fool people. They had a lot of fun playing with that. They were making wort beer as a side product of making the moonshine. And when the wort beer starches start to turn to sugar and they're starting to foam, that's when you stop the process, take the beer and sell the beer. Here we see a picture of some wort beer. It had if you weren't careful, you could get a glass of foam, but most of the time you could get a glass that would look like this if you were careful with it. The demand for wort beer was very strong. There were people who were being arrested left and right, and as soon as they were arrested, new people were coming in to start new production. In my father's case, the sequence of events leading to his arrest were like this. In the spring of 1933, my dad hooked up with a guy by the name of Stochi, and they decided to buy a still to make moonshine. They rented a farm. My father rented a farm just south of town, off the Pelican River, called the Mahalski Farm. Now, I don't know whether or not this is any indication that the first still that my dad had and was prosecuted for was on the Pelican River or not. But the story that came through the family was that there were people in the hospital who were patients looking out the window, and after a snowfall, they noticed that there was no snow from a house on the top of the hill across from the hospital. And so an investigation found that there was a still there that was draining hot mash into the river. Well, my father was arrested, but then no one ever said he was arrested for that still. That's an educated guess on my part, that he was. In any event, on the second still that they set up on the Michalowski farm, John Beulah, who had been the brewmaster for Al Capone out there in the Harrison Hills, and Wheaton, a guy by the name of Wheaton, set up the still and began production. And they were running about 200 barrels a day. Stochi for whatever reason, I don't know, and was known as a pistol packer, came with a gang of guys on June 17th and stole the still. They took it up to Saxon and set it up and started production from there. In June and July, my dad recovered the still. Now, one article in the Daily News says that Stoje gave it back to him. One article in the Daily News says he went up there and stole it back. So you can decide which one it is, because I don't have a clue. But in any event, Dad ended up with the still again. On August 15th, then Cherney, Wheaton, and Beulah were all arrested. So the three were arrested for making moonshine. The federal men conducted a raid on the big still. It was 100. It was in a two-story building, and there were 3 of them that were arrested. By the time the trial came, there were 5 that were involved in the verdict. The feds came in and destroyed all the equipment. It was just kind of a travesty to those who were making the moonshine. Here's a picture of some of the equipment that was destroyed. So there was a controversy in the newspaper about where the still was located, and here's the 2 possibilities. One article in the newspaper said that the still was located in the basement of the riverside. One article said that it was located in the house that was between the 2 taverns. Let's take a look at the driveway. You have the yard in the top center of the picture, and from Highway W or Highway 17, whatever it was called at the time, that highway has been known as Highway W, Highway 17, Pine Lake Road, Lake Creek Road. It's had a lot of names. In any event, that private driveway has a parking lot in front of that red tavern. There's no parking lot in front of the yellow house. The water over by that red building is pretty deep, but if you go closer to shore, it's not so deep. By the house, the current is fast, and if you pump mash into the water, that would be dissipated quickly. People ran their septic systems into the lake, so if they saw melted snow coming across where a septic system would have been, nobody would have paid much attention. There was nobody living on the south side of the lake, so nobody would be noticing things there anyway. The deep water is pretty still, right where the red tavern would be, where the riverside would be, but the water that goes past the house is moving swiftly. So that would be another reason why the product would be washed away. So for those reasons, I'm choosing that the place where they made the moonshine would have been the house. Also, in the riverside, if you went down into that basement, the ceiling was not very high, and you needed a high ceiling in order to be able to produce your moonshine. The Daily News gives the 2 locations for the still, and here you see a list of the reasons that I just went over then, that it was at the riverside with the low ceilings, the still water, a parking lot where people could observe what was going on, shelves for bottles, a very small area to work. The shelves for the bottles were hidden shelves. When you went in the basement, there were large boxes of stuff on regular shelves, but if you knew where the secret button was and pushed it, those shelves rotated. And on the back side of the shelves, they had places big enough to hold bottles with a small board across the front so the bottle wouldn't tip out when the shelf was turning. So that was at the Riverside. I believe that was a bottling facility, and I believe that the house was the brewing facility. In the meantime, after the people were arrested for producing the moonshine, John Stochy, Dad's former business partner, took up with a guy by the name of Robert Rogers. Now, Rogers was coming down here from Hurley, and nobody knew much about him from the time he arrived there, which had been probably 15 years before that. So he was kind of a mystery. After he was dead, they found out things about him that they hadn't known before. But Rogers had, when he was at the Riverside, had been an employee at the Riverside. He was known to be abusive. He had a common law wife. Apparently he beat her up a few times. Otherwise, they didn't know much about him. Stochy was that thug from Hurley. He was the pistol packer. So what they did was they tried to extort money from a tavern owner by telling him that they were his friends. Let's see here. Okay. They sent him a letter. They sent him a series of letters. So the first crime they committed was violating Postal Service Postal Service laws that said that you could not extort people through the post office. But in part, the letter said, "Please pardon this long letter. We mean what we say." Having a hard time reading this, but it says, "We're going to ask of you a favor. If you value your life and property, please pay strict attention. We want $5,000 from you, and we want it now in 10% and 20%, $10 and $20 unmarked bills. Stay away from the law, or you're going to lose your life. We only work with a person once, and then we leave them alone, so we won't bother you anymore." So that was the kind of letter they were sending. In any event, what happened with Stochy is they said to the authorities, they said to Godot, who owned the tavern, "Leave money in a bag where we have a white cross by the side of the road." And so they were not supposed to let the authorities know that they were paying off this extortion plot, but they did. So sheriffs from Oneida and Vilas County made a plan of their own. They order was shoot to kill, because they assumed that these people would be armed. And when they got out of the car to pick up the money, they were shot. Stochy actually was not killed. Apparently the machine gun that was being pointed at him misfired. In any event, Stochy got a deal. He gave the feds a tip on a big still, and the big still he gave them the tip on was my father's. As far as the trial results are concerned, Charles Wharton got 60 days in jail, and he was warned to tell the truth. Sam Turney was fined $50. His brother said that he did know nothing about what was going on in the basement. He insisted that was true. My dad said that he was telling the truth, and he was acquitted. John Beulah was needed to testify in another trial elsewhere, so they dismissed the charges against him. And Kenneth Brusso also had the charges dismissed. I'm not sure why. Don't know exactly what went on, but my brother John told me at one time Dad made a deal with each of these guys that he would work to get them off and that they could pay him off when he got out of prison, because he was the only one who wasn't married. He was the only one who didn't have children, and he didn't want those men taken away from their families. So what were the charges against Dad? He was charged with unlawfully and knowingly possessing materials and equipment that were designed for the manufacturing of intoxicating liquor, and he was charged with fermenting mash in an unregistered still. At that time, you could then register your still and pay to be able to make moonshine, and so you were paying taxes on it. Federal government felt if you were paying taxes, that was good enough. So Dad was sent to Leavenworth. At Leavenworth, he had some very interesting stories to tell. One of them was that you could steal something like a chicken, but you couldn't steal a chicken leg or you would get caught. So, or you could steal a whole pie, but you couldn't steal a slice of pie or you would get caught. So they removed cement blocks between two cell blocks, and in between those two cell blocks, there was quite a large open space that held all the pipes and the wiring and the equipment that ran through the prison. They would have parties back there every night and have chicken or pie or whatever they had stolen from the kitchen. The guards that knew about what they were doing would walk right on past their cells and not pay any attention, and the guys would hand them coffee or a piece of pie or whatever they had. The guys that were going to give them a hard time about it, they would see it pee on the floor in front of them as they walked by. So he said they had their own hierarchy there. If you were a squealer, they would put bars of soap in socks and beat you with it. And some of them came out alive and some of them didn't. My dad was released from prison in 1936. He had the 2 taverns, but when he got out, it was a surprise. He hadn't told anybody he was coming home. And here his head lady that he had lived with for 13 years was carrying on with the bartender at the Riverside. And the stock was gone, the money was gone, their businesses were in shambles. So there was quite a bit of arguing that was going on between Dad and this woman by the name of Mary Gorell. He ended up having her shipped off to Illinois. Not shipped off, but this is a picture of Mary, but she's quite a bit older here. Anyway, he got his friend Palmer Peterson to move her to Chicago in 1938. Now that was interesting because when she moved to Chicago, I ended up staying at her house one time, 3839 Maypole Avenue in Chicago. It's right off of Madison, and it's in Cicero. Guess who's headquartered in Cicero? Al Capone. So she didn't move very far from where she was used to working with some of the people. When she was an older lady, she remained Dad's friend, and she would come to visit us at our house every summer and stay for a week. My mother had to be quite a trooper to put on with that kind of conduct. There was nothing going on between them romantically or anything. She just was known by we children as Aunt Mary. And that was the end of it. At the Pine Lake Inn, which was called Dick and Dolly's later on, and today is a vacation rental property, still called Dick and Dolly's. This was Margaret with my dad. Margaret was the cook. She worked there when I was a little girl. She was an excellent cook, and we loved her, and we called her Aunt Margaret. My mother arrived in Rhinelander in 1939. Dad had been remodeling the Pine Lake Inn, and he was ready to get some new girls. So we went to Milwaukee looking for girls. My cousin Buster, or Dad's cousin Buster, ran a tavern there of his own, and he also tended bar when they needed him out at the country club. It was out there that my mother worked, so Buster and my mom had become friends. My mother had ended up pregnant and ended up with serious illness when she aborted the baby. And she was lying in bed in her hotel room when my dad knocked on the door and came in. She said he was a grizzly-looking old man with 2 days' worth of beard growing on him. She said he'd been drinking, he smelled horrible, and he sat on the side of her bed and offered her a job in Rhinelander. She said she couldn't leave town. She owed too much money. She owed her roommate, she owed the hotel, she owed for groceries, she owed for a lot of things. She had to work to make that up. He peeled off a $100 bill and threw it on the bed, asked her if that would take care of it. She said her eyes must have popped wide. She'd never seen a $100 bill before. She hesitated and hemmed and hawed, and he peeled off another one and threw that on the bed too. She said after a couple more, she finally said yes, and she went to Rhinelander with my dad and worked there. This is my mom a little bit later. But anyway, she was tending bar for Dad. He asked her if she was 21. She said yes. So she was tending bar. The sheriff came in and asked Dad whether or not he was crazy to have this young girl tending bar for him. And Dad said, well, she's of age. The sheriff said, you better check again. She's not of age. So Dad asked Mom, and she said she was only 20. He took her to Upper Michigan, Bessemer, and married her that day. You could have your wife tending bar for you, but you could not have your girlfriend tending bar. So she became his bartender. This is the bar itself. You can see here where the bar stools are on the right, and the entrance to the bar is right there with that door with the glass. Today it looks like this. I had my last birthday party there, and we decorated the inside of the place, and it was a gorgeous bar room. This is the door into the residence. Off that stone porch, you can see the window and the reflection, but behind the door and the window reflection, you see a brown door. That led to the bathroom. So for ladies to go to the bathroom, they would leave the tavern, walk through our living room, and into the bathroom. So we kids were not allowed to sit around in our pajamas. We had to be fully dressed when we were out there. And we were not supposed to make a lot of noise and disturb the bar patrons. This is a picture that's much more clear. You can see the kind of furniture we had. The first doorway is the doorway into the kitchen. You can see the stove in the background there with ovens. And to the right is the doorway the ladies used to go in the bathroom. Later on, there was a telephone put between those two doors so that people who wanted to be in the bar and use the phone would come and pick up the receiver from there. Well, then we kids, if we were real quiet, could hear their whole conversation. It was interesting. Today it's interesting to look back and see it from an adult perspective based on what they had said. This is my mother behind the bar. You can see the stools in the bar front. There, it was a solid bar. Today, half of it is left. The new owners have taken one half of it and moved it into the living room, and the other half is gone. And the living room, or the bar room, is now their living room for this vacation rental. Here's another picture of Mom right around the time that she was arrested. She was running the tavern after hours, and so she didn't close the bar until the last patron left. If that was 3 o'clock in the morning, that's when she turned off the lights. So there was a raid that night, and the officials came in and raided the bar and arrested her. And they arrested the other girls that were there, took them down and threw them in jail. She said from there it was just kind of a party for the rest of the night because they had raided a number of places. So all the girls and the bartenders from all the taverns were there. The guys got a hold of a coffee pot. They had coffee and so forth. And a mouse ran through the jail cell. One of the girls started screaming. So it was just kind of, she said, they had a good time that night. The next morning they took her in and questioned her repeatedly about things. That wasn't quite so cool. On this one here, this is the blue light that was in front of the bar. There was a mirror. There is a mirror. It's still there on the ceiling. It still works. And there was a blue neon light around it. I used to lay under that when I was a kid and make faces at myself and pretend. Lots of pretending. I was born in 1943, and things began to change. Prohibition was over. Dad became involved in some legitimate businesses and was trying to make a living honestly. This is a picture of me with my brother John, and Dad's family was starting to grow. At part of the time when we were about the age, that last picture, Dad was still involved a little bit in things that were illegal. One of them was gambling. He had gambling upstairs in the house between the two taverns. We were living downstairs, and he decided that based on how they had questioned my mom over the raid at the tavern, he didn't want her to have to go through that again, and he didn't want his children exposed. So he moved us to Thayer Street. This is my Aunt Clara's house on Thayer Street. It still sits there today. In the meantime, they had this roulette wheel, which was very fancy. This is not it, but it was a beautiful roulette wheel and very expensive. So there were calls all over the county for gambling to be stopped and how evil and awful it was. So they went to Hurley. Oh, there was a sheriff that was involved in this too. The sheriff was running for re-election, and he wanted the reputation of being getting rid of crime. So he and my dad went to Hurley and bought an old broken down roulette wheel. They brought it back to Rhinelander and advertised that there was going to be a public burning of this evil thing. So they went out into the parking lot and took some axes and smashed it up and burned it. Nobody got close enough to see that it really didn't work. The good one was stored in barns and eventually was stored in the attic of the grocery store that we ran later. This is some of the bean fields that my dad had. He planted beans. This is across the street. No, this is the one that belonged to Frito-Lay out on Spider Lake Road by Camp Tasomas. So there were two bean fields that were there. There was another bean field across the street from the Hodag Country Fest. So that was another one of Dad's ways of trying to earn money. He built a house that was supposed to be a house for his family to live in. Then he changed his mind and decided to turn it into an insulation plant. So in the insulation plant, they had ground up cardboard, and they used this as the insulation. They bagged it up, ground it up, mixed in some stuff. I don't know what it was. I used to think it was great to be able to work the bagging machine. I was probably about 9 or 10 at the time. Dad and a friend by the name of Mr. Shipman bought a camp called the Lake Creek Camp, and Dad was a silent partner. People didn't know that he had purchased it, and it was purchased in 1948. Coming in from the left-hand side, if you can see County W, then the first brown building that's there was the County Town Hall and Workshop. They stored equipment there. They had their council meetings there, and all the parties that were going on would be there. Across the street from that, there were 19 cottages up on the hill, and so all the cottages were included. Down on the corner is a little green building. That green building was the grocery store, and next to the grocery store, the little blue building, was the Wilcox house, which still stands today. On River Road, river goes straight out to the Country Fest, but on the corner there was a gas station and a bar. This is a picture of the Lake Creek Camp earlier than when they bought it, but it gives you an idea of what was going on. The grocery store is the building toward the back of the picture, and it's right, the front door is right on the road. So if you opened the door, you had to be careful, be sure there were no cars coming. The building above that is a shower house building. And then the building on the right was the gas station. You can't see it, but the road toward the Country Fest goes between the grocery store and the gas station. This is my dad in his older years, standing in front of the grocery store, and the gas station is behind him across the street. Dad loved his dog. His dog's name was Pooch. This is a picture of them taken in 1960, and my dad died on April 7th of 1962. This is the town hall. The town hall was just used for everything. Dad was, because he was a federal criminal, lost a lot of his privileges. One of them was the right to vote. Another was the right to carry a firearm. He wasn't allowed to leave the country, couldn't get a passport, had his money checked on to see where it was coming from. His financial records were not a secret. There were a lot of consequences of being convicted of federal crime. So although he couldn't vote, he could influence votes. He had lots of customers came into the grocery store, and he would talk to them about politics and how they should be voting. And a lot of them just were not voters anyway, so he would just shag them over to the town hall and get them to vote. This is a picture taken not too long ago of what is today called Dick and Dolly's. I called it the Pine Lake Inn. You can see that's the way the building looks today. This is the former Wilcox house. That's still sitting there. It had a grocery store in it, a laundromat. It had a Dr. Dunn's Animal Services there. And the latest that it was a bookkeeper's house. Right here next to that Wilcox house is the spot where the grocery store stood. The grocery store went as far as the trees on both sides and right out to the road. It's another picture of that same corner with the road going off to the left is River Road. You can see the signs on the right-hand side pointing people either straight ahead or to the left. This is my family, picture taken quite a while ago, but This is my mom in the center, my youngest brother, Mark, on the left-hand side next to John. John was the oldest. Then we have Charlie. We have Mike. None of us have turned out to be bootleggers. We haven't turned out to be criminals. My brother Mark runs a very successful landscaping business in Chicago. John was pretty high up in the Customs Department, in charge of the budget for the Customs Department of the United States before he retired. I taught for 37 years. My brother Charlie was a radio host and big into radio and sportscasting. And my brother Mike worked for the Colorado Department of Natural Resources. So we've all done pretty well. Thank you for listening to the story of my family.